Just 1 minute and then we'll start. Okay, we should be live on Facebook now as well. If someone could send a message, if that's working, that would be really great. Welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. This is a panel discussion by Platypus Manchester on this special occasion, which is the date that would be Friedrich Engels' 200th birthday. It's obviously strange to be doing this virtually over Zoom. It'd be nice if it was in person, but such is the way things are at the moment. And this is also the very first panel discussion that we've ever organized at Platypus Manchester. And today we have a double set of panel discussions. So we've gone full on with that. So thanks again for joining. It's nice to see a good number of people here. I'm going to set the scene and just give a few introductory remarks about the proceedings today. So I'm David Mountain. I'm a student at the University of Manchester. I'm founder of the chapter Platypus Manchester here. I'll be the moderator of this first panel, Engels at 200, the housing question revisited. This is the first of two panel discussions, and this one has more of an introductory and open scope. The second panel discussion will be at 7 p.m. today on the same Zoom link. And the second one will concern more specifically the question of tenants and renters and the politics of organizing. First off, a few remarks about Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006, and it is a project of critique and education concerned with exploring the improbable but not impossible reconstitution of an emancipatory Marxian left, of the politics of revolutionary politics and the goal of human freedom. Our slogan is, "The left is dead, long live the left." We are located at universities internationally, and at each university and across different chapters, we organize reading groups, panel discussions, research, and journalism. Here at the University of Manchester, we run a weekly reading break. We run a weekly reading group, which is at Tuesdays at 6 p.m, and a weekly coffee break, which is more informal, on Fridays at 5 p.m. And you'd all be very, very welcome to join us for those. These currently take place on Zoom, and information can be found on the Platypus Manchester Facebook page, web page, and the Student Union page, where you can also join as a student member. Moving on to the panel discussion at hand now, I'm going to read out the panel description and the questions posed to the panelists. Friedrich Engels' The Condition of the Working Class in England documented the impoverished condition of urban housing and of working class life in Manchester in 1844, a moment of rapid industrialisation and urbanisation. Following these observations and many more, Engels in 1872 wrote The Housing Question, a polemic directed at both anarchists and liberal social reformists. In the critique of social reformist urban planning approaches to working class housing, Engels understood the slum clearance schemes of his time as simply a geographical displacement of the problem of capitalism. Like the 1840s, recent decades have seen economic recession, political turmoil, and huge increases in the value of land and rent. It also appears that there is a return to the tenure split of the 19th century, when private renting was the dominant form of tenure. The critique of housing and urbanization expresses contradictions inherent in capitalism. So on the occasion of Engels' 200th birthday, we ask 3 questions. What do lessons of the past hold for present-day struggles for good housing? What would Engels think of the situation of housing and urbanization in 2020? And finally, what does the housing question mean for the left today? Each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes for opening remarks. In fact, let's make that 8 to 12 minutes. There's only 3. This will be followed by then like 3 to 5 minutes to respond to each other. So that will be a chance for the panelists to kind of like start a discussion between the 3. And then the floor will be opened for audience question and answer. And the whole duration of the panel will be 1.5 to 2 hours. Before I introduce the speakers, just some formalities about the question and answer session and the Zoom meeting in general. So we've made the meeting kind of webinar-like, which is a bit more informal because it's not actually a webinar. Because of this, please make sure that you keep your audio and your video muted unless you're speaking. I also suggest, if you haven't already, that if it might be the case that you need to click to hide non-video participants, which is an option I think you should be able to find in the top right corner, or you can just switch to speaker view so you only see the person who's speaking at the moment. Please, for the question and answer, feel free to send in questions whenever you like, including in the first part of the session. Please direct them to the account Platypus Manchester, which is Liam, who's helping in the background. You don't need to write out the question in full if you don't want to. Just a sentence of what you want to bring up would be great. Liam will be reading the questions and will recommend to me who to call on, and that way I can kind of like listen more carefully to the conversation rather than read any questions coming in. And what I'll do is I'll invite you to unmute yourself, and if you like, unmute your video as well to ask your question and introduce yourself. If you'd rather have the question read out by me, that's fine as well. Just make a note of that. I'm looking forward to the questions. So now I'm going to introduce the speakers. We have 3 speakers today. We have Dr. Stuart Hodkinson first. Dr. Stuart Hodkinson teaches at the University of Leeds and has been collaboratively researching with various housing campaigns since the mid-2000s. Then we have Lucy Nichols, who's a member of Counterfire and an activist in 9K for What, a new student campaign fighting against the commodification of the education system and in the interests of students. She's also involved in the occupation of Owens Park Tower that very recently won a 30% rent cut for students in halls in semester 1. Congratulations. Sam Holden is the 3rd speaker. Sam Holden is a final year PhD student at the University of Manchester. His thesis explores the alternative ways that the production and consumption of housing can reflect back on the contemporary housing sector and reveal understandings of wider political economy. That finishes all I want to do with the introductions. Thanks again for coming. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can everyone hear me okay? Or can just one person say that they can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today to speak on this very day.
Actually, Stuart, I think maybe the wire's rubbing against your microphone. Which is, okay.
Okay, how's that?
That's better.
I'm not taking my hands off the wire. All right.
Okay.
All right. But yeah, so just start again. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very important to remember Engels, especially on his birthday, and it's you know, what a great time to actually revisit the housing question and revisit the politics and the kind of intellectual insights that he gave us in many contributions during the 19th century. So I didn't know quite know how to frame all this in a short period of time and in a few minutes. So I'm just going to make a few points, and I feel like I've got probably a lot to say, and I'm just going to scratch the surface. I think it's important to begin just by situating the housing question, Engels's polemic from 1872, in the context of the time, where there were long-standing debates between, I suppose, on one hand, anarchists of various descriptions, and on the other, socialists of various descriptions, over how to politically respond to what was then, acute crisis of housing across Europe's working class during the mid-19th century onwards. And I think we all know that from reading Engels's first main book on the condition of the English working class, that the housing crisis in England, in the newly industrializing and urbanizing spaces of British capitalism was horrific in all kinds of dimensions. And so this was a very, very important political issue. And what Engels does in the housing question is kind of, no doubt, problematically, but we haven't got necessarily time to go into how he kind of frames all this, but he frames the kind of Proudhon anarchist solution to the housing crisis as one that seeks to effectively abolish private landlordism, which was seen as the kind of major cause of the housing problem, and turn the proletariat into a class of property owners. So effectively leaving different aspects of capitalism alone and concentrating on the housing problem, the relationships between landlords and tenants, as something that can be dealt with in its own way, in its own particular space. Now, Engels caricatured this as bourgeois socialism, and I think it's important to just think a little bit about why he said it was bourgeois socialism. Basically, he said that the housing crisis, effectively, there was no such thing as a housing crisis, in the sense that there's only crises of capitalism. So, and I quote here, "The so-called housing shortage, which plays such a great role in the press nowadays, does not consist in the fact that the working class generally lives in bad, overcrowded, unhealthy dwellings. The housing shortage from which the workers and part of the petty bourgeoisie suffer in our modern big cities is one of the numerous smaller secondary evils which result from the present-day capitalist mode of production." So for Engels, there could be no solution to the housing question, to the crisis of housing for the working class, outside of abolishing capitalism itself. And more problematically, any attempts to solve the housing question would be, in effect, counter-revolutionary. Now, I'll just take a step back there. I'll discuss a little bit more about why Engels thought that. What's also really powerful in the housing question, and all of Engels' writing on housing and cities and urbanization, is how he gives us this really important analysis of how urbanization, uneven development, speculation, gentrification, displacement all kind of come together in the urban realm, and how he's particularly linking, the contradictions of capitalism, effectively over-accumulation crises, and how, as David framed at the beginning of the session, how capitalism and the bourgeoisie seek to simply shift some of these problems around in their solutions to housing crises. And again, there's a great quote I want to bring up from the housing question, which is this: "The growth of the big modern cities gives the land in certain areas, particularly in those which are centrally situated, an artificial and often colossally increasing value. The buildings erected on these areas depress this value. They are pulled down and replaced by others. This takes place above all with workers' houses, which are situated centrally and whose rents, even with the greatest overcrowding, can never or only very slowly increase above a certain maximum. The result is that the workers are forced out of the centre of the towns towards the outskirts. So what Engels is doing very vividly is he's describing how speculation, land values, and what kind of we now might call rent gaps in urban space produce flows of capital in and flows of capital out of the built environment. And workers are always the victims of this process because their homes, their dwellings, their neighborhoods are in the way of profit. They're in the way of accumulation crises being resolved through more investment into now higher value areas of the city. So it's a really interesting and very prescient and very relevant analytical framework of how capitalism shapes urban space, and also how workers, working class, and how people just generally who don't have power over the city, don't have power, don't own property, don't have power in the system, are displaced and pushed out. It's also worth pointing out that Engels was also very prescient in kind of bringing to our sort of understanding of what was happening in 19th century industrial cities, just how human life was so devalued by capitalist production and consumption, how workers were disposable people. And so in The Condition of the English Working Class, he gave us the concept of social murder. And again, I want to read out a quote from that because I think it's very, very important for our discussions today. When society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual, social murder. Obviously, I've cut quite a few words out there, but what comes through there is, yes, the bourgeoisie, the state, those who have political and economic power in cities and in industrial life knew very well that they were sending thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to their early graves with both conditions in the factories, conditions in the housing quarters of cities, and they didn't care. And I think that kind of disregard and that idea of mass human disposability, because profit is more important, is really a powerful way of thinking about the present. So I don't know how long I've got left, but I'm just going to just keep working through a few more of my points. So back to how Engels then understands housing politics. For him, he dismisses the idea that you can pursue some kind of home ownership dream of the proletariat, which seemed to be how he was describing the anarchist solution to the housing question, being that we just abolish private landlordism, we convert rents to mortgages or to down payments on the property, and workers will magically become homeowners. For him, working class property ownership was just replacing a kind of one unequal relation with another. So rent might become mortgage debt, the landlord might become the bank. The workers, however, would become more immobile. They would be tied to their property. They would be tied to the gardens and the allotments that supposedly came with home ownership, where they were imagined to be supplementing their wages with their own production at home. This would actually give, according to Engels, the capitalists greater social power to exploit labour in the sphere of production. because workers would now be tied to their homes. They would be less mobile, less flexible, less able to go and look for other work when they needed to. They would also, and then the second aspect of what Engels was saying was around the issue of self-help and building societies. You know, the idea that workers could club together, could collectively put their wages into building societies and gradually build their way out of their own housing crisis. Well, this, according to Engels, would only benefit better off workers. It'd also be divisive. It would divide the working class on these issues. He also saw state intervention as a dead end, because for him, the state was on the side of, quote, the landowners and the capitalists, and would never intervene in the interests of the working class. And so for him, housing politics, just like any kind of single issue politics, would be diverting attention from the production sphere and would be creating the illusion that, quote, all wage workers can be turned into capitalists without ceasing to be wage workers, a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. So Engels was clear: overthrow capitalism first and the bourgeoisie, and then redistribute existing housing and land. Anything else would be dangerous utopias. So what would Engels say about housing and urbanization in 2020? Well, as I've already alluded to, and to use my best German, ich hatte recht, nicht wahr. He would probably say that he was right, wasn't he? His work was in some respects a prophecy of the contemporary urban experience. He would, you know, look, if we think about these cycles of disinvestment, investment, gentrification and displacement, land value, rent gaps, capital flowing in and flowing out, and all the time, you know, power being exercised over the working class in cities. He would, you know, he would very much see his analysis then in the present moment. He would particularly hate so-called regeneration schemes, because he would just see that as exactly the same thing dressed up in the language of neighborhood improvement. He would see regeneration actually as just about allowing capital to invade spaces that were previously were outside of its scope, or about just moving different populations on to grab land for profit. He would point out in particular how the right to buy, you know, one of Thatcher's most brilliant policies from a political perspective, has not liberated workers, but actually become a conduit for boosting private landlordism. And therefore it was proof that the bourgeois socialists of his day were wrong. Effectively, you know, having property rights and individual property does not change anything else about the capitalist mode of production. The social relations of capitalism still remain, and people can very easily lose their homes and become renters and tenants again. He would also see in Grenfell Tower and the petrol-clad facades of neoliberal urban landscapes evidence that social murder continues unabated. However, whether or not he would still see housing as a secondary evil and subordinate realm of exploitation under capitalism, I'm not sure. I think that Engels was so brilliant in the way he understood capitalism that he would surely by now have seen that housing is not kind of like a poor relation of production. It's part of the sphere of social reproduction, and that social reproduction is as important to capitalism as production, and that financialization of capitalism means housing and land are increasingly central to accumulation strategies and class struggles in their own right. And I'm sure that he would have shifted his position on that. In terms of lessons of the past for present struggles and what does it mean for the left, I think what I take from Engels and what I take from the debates that he entered into and created himself is that we can't wish away capitalist social relations, yet nor can we wait for the revolution. So there are obviously dangers of particular forms of self-help and community housing models that don't challenge the wider context of housing injustice, but also it's a kind of dead-end politics if we oppose community level initiatives for being compromised, for being reformist, for being bourgeois, or for missing the bigger picture, because I feel like we need both. We need housing movements that understand capitalist social relations and understand about how the strategic landscape in which we're operating. But we also need people to be fighting for better housing in the here and now, because that's just as important. Secondly, I think that Engels shows us that context and events can change the politics of housing. So if we look at COVID, the COVID context, suddenly anti-eviction politics works. You know, spending decades and decades trying to get different governments to roll back on, you know, the idea that you can be evicted after 6 months, and that, you know, every month or every 2 months you are potentially going to be out on the streets. Well, actually, you know, COVID changes the context, and also rent strikes become more possible in certain situations because of the nature of the landlord-tenant relationship in this wider pandemic we're in. So context and events can change the politics of housing. Just as with Grenfell, Grenfell as a spectacular event of social murder makes re-regulation possible, and it brings back into fashion health and safety, which was at the very origins of the trade union movement, the idea of health and safety of workers. It's kind of sometimes been seen as not that interesting, not that sexy, not that fashionable in sort of left politics, but actually health and safety becomes so important once again, and we can actually make political inroads on those things to protect people. So I feel like my key lesson from the Engels debates is that the left must make the mundane militant. It's easy to go after the big corporate landlords and rentier capitalism, but we have to, I think the way that we win, both in the short term and the long term, is through organising communities on the things that matter most to them in terms of their housing conditions and other things. So that's my opening, probably not 10 minutes. Thanks very much.
That's fine. Thanks very much, Stuart. Next, handing over to Lucy.
Hi, sorry. I first like to start by saying if you hear any background noise, it's because I think my housemate is having a dance party in her room, and I would tell her to shut up, but I think she's having too much of a good time and I don't want to do that. Yeah, I'm Lucy. I'm a second-year student at the University of Manchester studying Arabic and Spanish. I'm also involved with Counterfire 9K for What, and I just got out of a very long stint sitting in Owens Park Tower begging Nancy Rothwell to give us some of her money, and we were successful. We got 12 million quid out of her, so that was good. I probably don't need to go into too much detail about what the housing question is about, because I think Stuart's just explained it, and I imagine everyone else probably knows it in a bit more detail than I do. But I did find it interesting how Engels sort of posited that you can't solve the social question by solving the housing question. You can't magically end capitalism or end oppression of the working classes by giving every working man a house. It just doesn't work that way. He rejected private property entirely, which is as Marxists, as socialists, it's something we should all do. And he said that private property, as Stuart explained, plays a central role in creating, I think he said, a society driven and moulded by capital accumulation by the working class. And he also went on to say that all workers are exploited, but if you're renting, if you're a tenant, you're not necessarily exploited, because by the time you get to paying rent, you've already been exploited for your wage labour by the capitalist, even if you are paying rent to a capitalist. So he said, which I quite liked, paying rent is a quite ordinary commodity transaction between citizens. And I try and remember that. That's what Engels said whenever I pay my rent every month, which is extortionately expensive because I'm a student, and that's just how it goes. I wanted to today talk a bit about student housing and how can we fit that into the housing question, and housing as a general problem of capitalism as a secondary evil, I think is what Engels called it. So yeah, where do universities fall into this equation? Where do universities fall in even to the Marxist way of thought, of what Engels would have thought about it? Well, I think quite simply that the modern university, the neoliberal university, is a Marxist worst nightmare. First of all, they exploit their workers. Lecturers are exploited. They're underpaid and overworked and made to work in poor working conditions, especially at the University of Manchester. For example, they're forced, not in the University of Manchester, but at places like Birmingham and Bristol, they're still having to do face-to-face teaching, which is just a danger to their health, obviously, and the health of students. In addition to lecturers being exploited for their labour, so are cleaners. At my university, when there was a big outbreak of coronavirus in the Fallowfield campus, cleaners were forced to clean COVID-positive flats without any PPE. And cleaners are paid even worse than lecturers and made to work in even worse conditions in general. Second reason why a modern university is a Marxist worst nightmare is what they actually teach, and they actively encourage people away from learning and teaching about Marxism or leftist thought. If you're an economics student, it's unlikely that you're going to learn anything other than capitalism. And you'd think, as you know, as a language student or as a humanities student, I'd have a different experience of that because all my teachers are supposed to be lefties. But I'm currently doing a module on revolution in Latin America, and I don't think the word socialism has been brought up once. Neither has Marxism, apart from me in the seminars, obviously. So there's that, you know, there's active encouragement away from leftist thinking. So universities are kind of just moulding the next capitalists for the future. Encouraging everyone that if they get a nice big degree, they'll have a nice cushy job and then one day be able to own their own home. And then lastly, of course, universities own huge amounts of land. I was talking in the Tower the other day, and one of the people I was occupying with told me that apparently once upon a time you could get from King's College Cambridge to King's College Oxford without leaving land owned by, well, only by walking on land owned by King's College Cambridge. And the University of Manchester is no different. It owns 3 accommodation campuses and two academic campuses, something like that, which is just horrendous. So they own this land, they own this wealth and capital, and they need, as Lenin put it, special bodies of armed men, campus security, to protect this land. And I have first-hand experience of campus security, and they are not the nicest people. I think they think they're protecting us as students, but really they're just doing what the police do, and that's protecting the interests of the people who pay them. And then if you own, as universities own so much land, they're landlords as well, aren't they? They rent out student accommodation to students. And I think student housing is a very strange phenomenon, and I wasn't really sure how to approach it from this perspective when I was thinking about what I was going to say today. Because first of all, students aren't actually tenants. At the University of Manchester, students aren't tenants under the law, that is. They're licensees. They pay for a lease to live in student accommodation for a certain amount of time. So under the law, they're actually closer to hotel guests than they are tenants. Or, you know, I'm in private accommodation, I'm a second year, so I'm a tenant, but if you're in halls, you're a licensee. So it's very strange, and they don't quite have the same rights under the law as a tenant would, which is how they end up living in one of the reasons how they end up living in such appalling conditions. I've been speaking to freshers since, you know, the rent strike happened and all that's been going on in Fallowfield, and I'm speaking to freshers who've had to deal with mold, damp, broken furniture, break-ins, pests like rats and silverfish, floods, and all sorts, and it's just not being taken seriously by maintenance, which is just, you know, it was bad before coronavirus, and then coronavirus hit and it just got 10 times worse because you're living in these crappy student accommodation halls so much more and you never leave, and it's just horrible. But students are more or less at the whim then of the people who they're renting off of the university, their landlord, that is, and their landlord is deeply committed to growth, as are most capitalists, well, all capitalists, deeply committed to this idea of growth. So they want to keep building more accommodation and keep growing and keep getting the university bigger. And I think student housing then for a university is a fantastic way to make money, because you get to charge a ridiculous amount of money. I think the average student in Fallowfield, or actually no, in student accommodation in Manchester, will pay something like £6,000 a year, on top, of course, of the tuition fee, which are £9,000 a year. So, you know, you make so much money off student accommodation and students, it makes sense economically to build more of it. So student housing, is cheap to maintain because they don't maintain it. It's cheap to build because it's built in really in working class areas that are really cheap anyway, and it's built with for example, the Owens Park Tower has the same insulation as Grenfell, so it's built with cheap materials. There was that incident, I think last year, where a student accommodation block in Bolton completely burnt down because it had the same cladding as Grenfell. So they build it really cheaply and they maintain it really cheaply, but then they charge extortionately high prices to live in it, because they have the monopoly and they can do it and stuff. But even then, students still want to live in cheap areas. Living in Fallowfield is going to be cheaper than the city centre, even if living in Fallowfield and student accommodation is way more expensive than living in a normal house in Fallow or Withington or Didsbury or wherever. That's I hope that's, sorry, I've gone off a bit of a whim, but that tries to explain why student halls are so expensive and why universities want to make so much money out of students. but all this, like students living in really cheap working class areas and having halls built in really cheap working class areas and being stuck in these halls in like rubbish conditions, sort of ends up anyway in this weird gentrification of places like Fallowfield and Withington, I suppose, and even Rusholme, because students want to live in these cheap places, and then students also like nice coffees and like nice restaurants, so they end up building these nice coffee shops and these nice restaurants in very working class areas. And in turn, that obviously attracts more students, so it just gets more and more gentrified, and the residents of the local area are pushed out and have antagonisms, and there's like battles between students and residents, which I know are very common in Fallowfield, particularly because I've been, you kind of see it, there's this sort of, I don't know, this sort of feud between local residents and the students who are going to give them coronavirus. Not necessarily, that was a joke. So yeah, there's this like antagonism between students and residents. For example, in Hume, there's this pub called the Gamecock that's now closed down, but there's developers who want to turn it into an 11-story student accommodation block, and the local residents are obviously completely against it. So it's happening like all over the place. I'm sorry, I sort of went off on a bit of a tangent then. What I'm trying to say is student halls are really crap, really expensive, and they really, really annoy the local residents because they push them out of their homes because the universities want to build more student halls, well, they have other student halls, and then they want to build more student halls everywhere else because they love to grow, and that's what capitalists do, they grow. So I'll try to answer the questions that were posed to me. I suppose Engels wouldn't be best pleased with this. He'd probably point to this as even more exploitation, even though tenants aren't necessarily exploited in the same way that the workers are. I think even if students aren't exploited by the university, they're certainly being treated very poorly by them. So Engels would probably link this to capitalism as a whole. When you have a for-profit education system that is obsessed with growth and making even more money, it's only fair that it ends up exploiting the people who are paying it, and ends up trying to cut corners, even if it is at the expense of the local residents and the students and all these kinds of people. And what does it mean for the left today? Well, I would argue what Engels argued is that we can't solve housing, particularly the issue of student housing and how it links to normal housing for working class people in student areas, without really taking a serious look at the for-profit education system, and the commodification of education and the massively neoliberal universities that just suck the life out of everyone they come near. Sorry, that was really mean. I do like my university, but I just think it's not very nice at the minute. Yeah, we can't really solve the housing problem without taking a serious look at the universities. And I don't think you can really take a look at really combat the for-profit education system without actually combating capitalism, because capitalism is so evil and so horrible that it forces everything to work and mold to it. So if universities treat us like consumers, we're going to end up keep treating universities like they're selling us something and that kind of stuff. So really, capitalism here is a problem. I agree with Engels. You can't solve housing without solving capitalism. You can't get rid of one without really getting rid of capitalism. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just agreeing with Engels. Really, is what I'm trying to say. That sort of explains it, I hope. I know I got a bit excited and went off on a bit of a tangent, but what I'm trying to say is capitalism is the root of all evil here. And I think the commodification of education, for-profit universities, neoliberal universities, all come as a byproduct of capitalism and this sort of push towards money that we see in even in academies and normal secondary schools and that kind of stuff. Has just obviously got to universities, and universities are the ones making the money out of it. So yeah, I think if we get rid of capitalism, maybe we can sort out this university problem as well. But I know that's quite a big ask. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, David. First, I've got to apologise before I start for my throat. I've, funnily enough, got a bit of chest infection thanks to my own precarious situation regarding mould in my flat that hasn't been fixed for over a month. Just to get in a very, in quite a, well, what would we say, a hipster area of Manchester. an area that you pay over the top rents and wouldn't expect these sorts of issues to happen. So you'll have to excuse my coughing. Yeah. So thanks everyone. You might not be able to see me now because I've got some notes on my tablet, and I think it's going to hide my camera screen. But I'm just going to talk today a little bit about my research, and I think it touches on some of these questions that we've been looking at, but I think both the other two panelists have answered them so well that I don't think I necessarily have to answer those questions directly, and I think that things can be extrapolated from my work. So the purpose of my PhD is to unpack and understand the definition of decommodification as an experimental process through undertaking and observing construction practices that emerge in reaction to contemporary UK construction logics. The initiator of these construction practices was Reach Homes, a fledgling not-for-profit housing producer in Sheffield that uses primarily waste materials and has a prototype and a small office. To quote their website, our eco homes, converted from shipping containers, start from just £35,000, cost 90% less to heat than a traditional home, and use more than 60% recycled local materials. Reach emerged as a reaction to recent waves of commodification within the production and consumption of housing. Decommodification was not a stated goal of Reach, rather it emerged from Reach's trial and error attempts to manifest a counter-movement to the contemporary housing sector. Housing across the globe is increasingly viewed as a speculative asset, and the UK is at the forefront of this process. Older people live in houses too big for them, whilst younger people struggle to pay their spiralling rent while scraping together enough to get a mortgage. The logic of a house as a tool for investment emerges not just from the companies whose tower blocks dot our skyline, but also from families where their house is a nest egg because the value of housing has risen far more rapidly than wages. These examples and the field at large explore mainly the distribution, how housing is attained, where and how it is spread across the globe, and consumption, how housing is being used. My research argues that there is a danger in only focusing on the consumption and distribution of housing without considering the production. In the Grundrisse, Marx argues that only focusing on distribution processes naturalizes the bourgeois production method, so that it is never questioned. As such, debates can rage around different distribution and consumption methods without ever questioning the way in which exploitative production occurs. Marx argues that production, distribution, and consumption should be understood together in order to avoid this naturalization process. As such, the production of housing plays a key role in my work as not only situating Reach's practice, but also as a way to critique the contemporary analysis of housing financialization. However, before I continue, I want to reiterate that ultimately capitalism is a crisis of overabundance. Just as there is enough food to feed the world many times over, there is enough housing to satisfy us all. And this is why distribution and consumption is important in contemporary housing debates. My work is to just show the other side of that coin. So I thought I'd introduce some examples that show how Reach's practice differs from contemporary construction. Each of these examples includes some form of decommodified process. And I think the best way that I'm going to kind of introduce decommodification here just quickly is as a process that seeks to lessen the pursuit of profit in the economy. So the first example is about labour. In contemporary construction, labour power has to be segmented to minimise any resistance to profit accumulation. Segmenting labour into professions weakens labour power. By having a series of different professions on the building site, joiners, brickies, scaffies, etc., each task requires less training than having to learn all of these tasks. This creates a more precarious workforce because the workers are easily replaceable as their job requires little training. Thus, there is potentially a vast number of workers available to replace them. Through the separation of these labourers, the construction industry is only reunited through the capital that binds these labours together, yet it is also capital that broke them apart, thus maintaining construction's contradictory reliance on it. Working with Reach, we underwent construction practices that didn't follow the division of labour in contemporary construction. This wasn't a conscious act by Reach to critique the division of labour in contemporary construction. Instead, it emerged out of Reach's method of construction and the lack of capital within it. Reach don't practice a capitalist mode of construction, not out of any other reason other than they don't extract profit from their work. instead of the pursuit of further capital being the driving force of Reach's construction method. It was most often the lack of capital that dictated it. This lack of capital became a driver for innovation, whilst our labour became less about individualised tasks and more about overall construction. And I'm going to read a quick extract from my work. Me, John and Billy were on site trying to work out our newest problem. We had cut a shipping container in two and were trying to separate the two halves without spending the 250 quid to hire a crane. For John, the solution was simple. We'll stick one half on poles and roll it like the Egyptians did 4,000 years ago. So that's what we did. We had some scaffold boards that were going to be used as flooring and some scaffold poles that we used to provide overhead electricity to the site. We used a heavy-duty jack to give us enough clearance for our scaffold boards and poles to slide underneath. We then lowered the container and tied it to the van. As the van pulled, me and Billy moved the pads that the container was previously sitting on in order to give it something to rest on. Here, the lack of capital became a driver for innovation in which myself, John and Billy came together to solve the problem. We could have separated ourselves into individual roles based upon our expertise and where we deployed most of our labour in the build process. John would be the site manager, Billy would be a general labourer, and I would be the designer. But this would ignore the fact that we all perform these tasks throughout various moments of the construction. Furthermore, the task of splitting the containers required 3 people, and Reach didn't have the funding to have 3 labourers, so we all took part. Collectively, we undertook the role of designer, in which we came up with a solution to pull the containers apart, of site manager, in which we thought through the logistics of the task, and of labourer, in which we performed the pulling apart. Another example is the way in which the materials were sourced. In contemporary construction, most materials are sourced through designers specifying a product that contractors sign off on and is then bought from manufacturers. The small budget Reach had meant this wasn't possible for them. Plus, their goal of producing with waste was to critique the amount of waste made on construction sites. As such, they sought free materials. Most often, this was waste. To read another extract from my work, a material Reach accessed through the construction process was the UPVC window frames. John told me how end-of-life recycling for this plastic is an energy-intensive process. As such, manufacturers recycle the glass and keep the frames in their yards, despite them being perfectly usable but second-hand. John undertook a simple transaction to acquire frames for the prototype. In exchange for the frames, Reach freed up space in the manufacturer's yard. Importantly, the frames get a second use of life, which is more efficient than recycling. In the case of the UPVC, end-of-life recycling for this plastic is an energy-intensive process, and as such, there is a constant supply of old frames that are in manufacturers' yards. The reciprocal process allows Reach to gain waste materials whilst freeing up space in the manufacturer's yard. Instead of critiquing the waste produced in the production of UPVC windows, this process supports the manufacturer to continue producing their waste. They're not critiquing the actions of the manufacturer at all. In fact, they're allowing them to continue. The final difference from contemporary practice that I want to talk about is the way in which Reach source the land for their projects. The main way buildings are funded is through construction finance, in which developers can buy the land to build the building. Construction finance is understood as investors providing money in order to get a return on their investment through profit on the building. Unlike the recent intense financialization of housing consumption, finance for construction is not a new practice and has played a role historically. An early recorded application of project finance dates back to 1299, when the English crown negotiated a loan from Frescobaldi, a leading Italian merchant bank, for which payment was to be made in the form of output from the Devon silver mines. The bank received a 1-year lease for the total output of the mines in exchange for paying all operating costs without recourse to the crown if the value or amount of the extracted ore was less than predicted. In this pre-capitalist example, the projected output from the mine was deemed financially safe enough for the bank to invest in the project. Moving through history with the development of the bourgeois mode of production, the global nature of financing allowed construction to expand the peripheries of capitalism through the development of the railways. This is very different to how Reach has secured land. Their business model doesn't have profit as an end goal, and so there will be no return on the finance's investment, and so there was never any incentive to invest. One example of Reach securing land happened in a deal with Ely City Farm, a not-for-profit that houses the South Yorkshire Energy Centre, an initiative that looks at localised green energy production. Rather than Reach paying for the tenureship of the land in money, Reach connects their solar panels, which provides a surplus of solar energy into the farm, and any surplus that is generated goes to power the South Yorkshire Energy Centre. The tenureship model worked well, as the prototype used only 10% of the energy of a traditional house, meaning not only has it not required a fuel bill since construction, but it's also produced a considerable energy surplus that is harnessed by the energy centre. Whilst this energy generated by REACH means the farm pays a reduced rate to the national grid, the process itself is successful because of the social ties between REACH and the farm. Many of the farm's aims align with REACH. So to move on to some kind of conclusion and how this relates back to how the housing question, I'd say that I'd want to go back to the understanding of decommodification and kind of what we've seen, we've briefly seen through these examples. So, excuse me. I argue that the definition of decommodification should be complicated. Firstly, it cannot be solely theorized. It can only be understood through observing practices, such as what I did with REACH. Secondly, decommodification may serve to reinforce existing socio-economic relations. For instance, the decommodified actions of REACH's material sourcing with the UPVC windows serve to support the waste practices of the window manufacturer. Finally, decommodification enables a move towards a less commodified future, whilst always in the knowledge that it acts within a commodified present, and this can be shown through looking at the whole of REACH. To further reiterate this point, whilst I find REACH's efforts commendable, I don't see their model as solving a contemporary housing problem. It would be very difficult for their project to scale because they are constantly fighting against profit in construction. What they can do is be a part of a general counter movement that reduces profit in the housing sector. Whilst this doesn't solve the contradictions of capitalism or the bourgeois mode of production, it can certainly lessen the impact they have on the most vulnerable in our society. And I think what I'm trying to start to argue is that this points towards how we might structure a housing sector where profit isn't the motivation for economic life. And I think I'll leave it there. I think it's important to understand that housing, in this sense, it has a way to it's a way of lessening the impact of the most vulnerable, whilst also understanding its own limitation, whilst also understanding the own limitations of the processes of practices such as REACH.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. So we're now going to move into the next part of the panel discussion, where I'm going to invite all three speakers to speak in turn for 3 to 5 minutes and to respond to the presentations that each other have given. If I could maybe also just kind of try and register sort of what's been spoken about and start the kind of conversation going a bit as well. Stuart, I felt thanks very much for this kind of exposition of Engels's thought. I thought what was really interesting particularly was your comments on how Engels might see the changing situation of capitalism today, and the fact that like land and its value has become such an important aspect of capitalism and capital accumulation in a way that it was, you say it wasn't so much. And I wonder if I'd be interested to hear more reflections on that and whether there's any disagreement about that. Lucy, thanks very much for the remarks. I thought that you were very critical of the neoliberalized education system and the way that that kind of relates to the city and to urban change, to gentrification. I would ask, is that any different? Yes, education maybe has changed, but really has that, is it any different to Engels's diagnosis of Haussmannization of Paris, to the displacement of the proletariat further out of the city? What's changed? And then Sam, I would just be interested to hear a bit more on your reflections on like the limitations of this kind of grassroots movement and like obviously the fact that like scalability of it is hard, the interrelationship with the state, with the local state, has been fractious and like dysfunctional, and kind of like more general reflections on what you've learned from this research. But yeah, first and foremost, if you could just kind of respond to each other's presentations in the same order that you spoke before. And then also, audience members, please start sending in your questions to the Platypus Manchester account. I'm looking forward to other people coming in and speaking. Thanks. So Stuart. Should your
Hello,
mute?
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Keep doing that all the time. Okay. I like the way that you're making my Saturday afternoon quite stressful, actually, because these are very big questions, and you know, I've got to think on my feet, and I've got kids about to jump in the room any moment, because they hover around and they just kind of unnerve me. Just as I'm in full flow, I might have to sort of separate them. But anyway, I'm going to try and do what you want, but I'm also kind of I'm going to try and respond to what you said, but also talk to the other panelists. But I'm still actually, in terms of Sam's presentation, I'm still actually thinking all of that through. So I might not directly ask Sam questions straight away. I might just ask him to expand a little bit more on what the project, or on what Reach actually is, because I was trying to understand a bit more about it. Lucy, I suppose my question to you, and I think all the issues that you raised there about how universities have, in being neoliberalized, have also become financialized, increasingly financialized, and or behave very much as financial actors. I mean, that's clear, and that's I'm working at the University of Leeds, and at this moment in time, I suppose we're all looking at Manchester and kind of looking at it in horror. But you know, it could happen to us at any time. That the pressures on university finance, the pressures on the competition between universities that's been opened up over the last so many decades, which is the same in all sectors of society. You know, different spheres of the public sector have been opened up for more and more competition, liberalisation, forms of marketization, league tables, and so on, mean that, and with the whole £9,000 fees and the changing of student and university finance being restructured to create this competition, and also it's set within a kind of global framework as well, where universities are not just competing on a national scale, they're also competing on a global scale in all kinds of hierarchies of different university education markets. Then yes, universities start to become divorced from education and teaching, and they start to become much more focused on capturing market share and financial flows, because their models, the business model of the university depends more and more on doing that, on short-term and long-term accumulation of a kind. So I think you're spot on there in thinking in how you brought all that together to talk about how universities a few decades ago were actually outsourcing and getting rid of a lot of their accommodation because they didn't see it as core to their business anymore. They had private landlords in the city who were prepared to obviously expand accommodation, moving into those sort of former working class neighborhoods that had been also disinvested, and as industry had moved out and manufacturing had moved out in many of these urban areas, students actually became, you know, not the saviors of those spaces, but they became like a source of reinvestment through that kind of connection between working class housing and student housing. But obviously then in more recent years, universities have been thinking, hang on a minute, you know, why are we missing out on the student rent? And not just that, we can do better. We can do much better than these private landlords. We know how bad the conditions are. It's an unregulated market. It's a free for all, and you know, we can come in and we can sort all this market out. We can actually charge higher rents because we know the students ultimately will get loans, and effectively this is the government funding us in a different way. So all of that is going on, and so yes, universities have gone from seeing their accommodation as peripheral back down to being core, and by doing that, they have obviously created a new source of conflict between the university and the student. So previous conflicts might have been over freedom of speech, or cancelling certain subjects, or not allowing someone to come and speak at an event, Now it's about actually, no, you're not only treating us as a consumers, and also because students also demand to be consumers increasingly. And again, it's not the students' fault, it's the way in which the whole thing's structured. You also get universities being landlords, but students not necessarily being tenants, being, like you say, licensees with different sets of rights. And also the whole blurring between student performance, exams, results, progression to the next level, and behaviour, and paying rent, and so on. So what's quite interesting about this moment is how universities kind of become vulnerable to rent strikes and to student protests and student occupations, but also how students themselves are quite precarious in those situations, and to organise to do that is actually very is brave, it's powerful, and it's something that I think we won't just see in Manchester. I think we'll see, and I think therefore what will happen in the contradictions of capitalism and how Engels would have probably also seen this, is that universities will probably seek to get out once again later on of accommodation and sell off their accommodation blocks in the future, because students will pose a risk to them and their business model. So that's something to think about, like where that goes. But to ask you a direct question, Lucy, what do you think Engels would make of your occupation? What do you think Engels would make of the rent strike as a political tactic and strategy? What do you think Engels would make of you focusing so much on that form of politics at the university, when he might have argued that's kind of like not looking at the prize? You're looking at the secondary evils. You're looking at housing, but you're not necessarily looking at like the underpinning causes. And how do you feel about, what do you think Engels would, how would Engels judge you? That's what I'm kind of asking. How do you feel that this kind of politics, how does it fit into this kind of framework that he presented us, or I presented of what he said at the beginning? And Sam, decommodification. I've written a bit about decommodification, and I feel like I've got more to say about that later on. But could you just explain a bit more about Reach as a project? Is Reach a conscious effort to decommodify housing, or are you seeing decommodifying practices in Reach, but actually Reach is just part of the system doing things differently based on its position in that industry?
Thanks, Stuart. Good questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for those questions. It gives me something to think about, I suppose. I'll answer Stuart's question first. I thought your points about students being consumers was really interesting, and I didn't know about in the past how unis didn't see student accommodation as anything viable, and they now do. I think that's really interesting. I think this idea that students are consumers is very, very commonly held amongst other students. There are obviously the 9K for what, we're all basically revolutionary socialists, and we're fighting very hard against this idea that students are consumers. And obviously we don't want to pay 9K, but that's because we don't believe we should pay tuition fees at all. And there are other student campaign groups that have set up that do see students as consumers, and do want a discount because we're not getting what we paid for, which I just think is, dangerous to the movement, dangerous to... If we treat universities as if we are if we act as if we are consumers, universities will treat us as so, and that's just opens up a whole host of problems. And in terms of what Engels would make of the occupation, I think that's a very good question. Obviously, this is a secondary evil that we were... sorry if you hear background noise, it's my flatmates being crazy. Yeah, obviously we are tackling a secondary evil rather than capitalism. But I think this act of direct action that we did, we had to do, we were forced into doing it, because otherwise conditions for students, the immediate conditions would just get worse. And I think, though, we didn't start a revolution, we didn't march into Downing Street with a guillotine, which obviously would be great. No, I'm not saying. Anyway, please don't report me to Prevent for saying that, is what I'm trying to say there. I think what we did in occupying and doing this direct action, we were taking on one aspect of a very rotten system, or a system that's rotten to its core. And I think we did it as revolutionary socialists as everyone in that occupation was, because we believe that by tackling one thing, we could probably inspire other people to tackle their own universities, and as we have done. There's rent strikes planned across the country, and maybe even a few occupations in a few Russell Group universities. So I think if we can, I don't want to call myself the vanguard because that's just awful, but it does spring to mind if we can start something and maybe it can take off somewhere else. I'm also not saying that these actions, me sitting in a tower for 2 weeks, is going to end capitalism, because I don't think it will. But I think if every little helps, is what I'm trying to say. Why for example, protest against war? Because protesting against war isn't really doing anything to end capitalism. You suppose you feel you have to do it because it will improve the immediate conditions for people. I hope that's answered your question. I hope Engels would like the occupation as well. I knew he was involved in a lot of actual praxis as well as theory, so hopefully he'd see what I did as a positive, maybe, I don't know, to ask him. And then to answer your question, David, is gentrification anything new? What's changed? Well, I think gentrification has been going on for decades and decades and decades. I think, the city of London used to be a very working class area. I have family that used to live there, and they were pushed out to the fringes of East London and North London because of gentrification, because these areas just get more and more expensive for whatever reason. I suppose what's changed, it's difficult to say. I suppose students have come along, and that's obviously made a difference to ideas of gentrification, because they live in poor areas and push working class people out, whether they want to do it or not. So I hope, I don't know what else changed really. I did have an answer a couple of minutes ago, and then I got distracted talking about Engels and revolution. I suppose it's not changed in the sense that it's still happening. I suppose it has changed in the sense that new people are doing the gentrification, who perhaps this new cohort, this new demographic of people didn't necessarily exist in the same way back when Engels was around and kicking.
Great. Sam.
Yeah, so I think both David and Stuart's questions kind of roll into one there, so I'll start to bring them up together. So to talk a bit more about reach, which I'm always happy to do, I think the best way to describe them is so basically they're a small not-for-profit housing constructor, effectively a small movement in Sheffield. I think they have gripes with contemporary issues, particularly around housing, but they're not specifically anti-capitalist or anything like that by any stretch of the imagination. What started my interest in reach in particular for the research was reading a lot of articles about housing and things, how other people are looking at solving housing, and either looking at people talking about how there needs to be more regulation, more social housing, or things such as community land trusts, mutual home ownership societies. And all these things kind of looked mainly around the consumption of housing and how it's distributed among society. And I kind of really wanted to bring that back and reanalyze this production behind it. And Reach kind of provided me with that opportunity to do that, because by looking at their production, it kind of reflected back on processes of capitalist housing construction. And it allowed us to kind of explore that a little bit more through my work. So to answer your other question, Stuart, I'd say that yes, it's not a conscious effort by Reach to perform decommodification practices, and this is kind of a central part of my work. It's about finding decommodification practices within there, and then saying that these are actually very much a part of our contemporary economy, of our economic ecology, really, and to not understand it as solely market transactions. So again, quite heavily based in the Grundrisse and other works like Polanyi as well.
Okay, thanks very much for doing that. I'm now going to open up to audience questions, and please keep sending in audience questions. You've had a few so far. And We're going to start with a question from Rebecca. Rebecca, if you'd like to unmute yourself and if you like, unmute your video and ask the question. If not, then, okay, hey.
Hi, I literally just got disconnected and I've written my, anyways, long story short, was looking for notes and they're not there. But I'll try to ask my question anyway. So I'd like to know from the panelists what they think capitalism is and why Engels warned against confusing a housing crisis movement as missing the forest for the trees, right? So like, what is capitalism? And what is the point of talking about housing as a problem in capitalism if it's not addressing the point, right? So I've heard from the panelists, like, we're going to address immediate interests, which then asks the question, well, when are we going to address the actual problem? It's a big question. I guess that's the point of having the panel. That's what I would pose to the panel. What is capitalism, and why should we be against it? And what is it in relation to housing? Like, why is, like, housing could be like a pressure point. What would it be?
Great. Which of you would like to start? Lucy?
Yeah, I'll go first. What is capitalism? That's a really good question. I wasn't really expecting to be answered that, and I don't know how to sum it up other than a really, really rubbish economic system under which we all live and we're all exploited. I think, simply put, we should be against capitalism because it relies on the exploitation of the oppressed classes and even the underclasses to survive, and it puts the power and the money in the hands of the few and leaves the rest of us rolling around on the floor trying to put enough coins together to eat and to live and to survive. And obviously it often means that people in the global south, people of colour, gay people, women, are oppressed way more. Obviously I'm not, classes, working class people just end up on the bottom and the elites end up on the top, and it just uses all these horrible things to keep the power and the money in the hands of the few. But in terms of fighting like directly against issues, I don't think I have a simple answers to that. Then I assume that's what you're asking, why it's important to come up against these direct issues when we see them and not go for capitalism at the core. And I would argue that in fighting against, any system, university system, military or anything like that, you are sort of fighting against capitalism at the same time, in that these things are part of capitalism, and you need to, if you want to put together a mass movement that can take down capitalism as the end goal, you need to start building it. And if you're going to, for example, win students over, you need to prove to them how capitalism actually affects them, and that is in the university at the minute for me, and the university is sort of a microcosm of I don't know, a capitalist state, I suppose, and that's not really relevant. That's what I was thinking about, a microcosm of a capitalist state, where students are the workers and they are also oppressed, not in the same way obviously, but still. So I would argue that you need to fight injustices when they come up, and I think in doing so eventually you will one day be able to have that power to get to capitalism. I'm sure I'll probably think of more good answers after I've stopped speaking, but I hope that's all right.
I might I might go a little bit counter to Lucy there, just to make things interesting, maybe. So I mean, in kind of a, because you ask however many socialists the definition of capitalism, they give you however many answers. But I think one way to understand it is kind of a moment of history, and especially to understand that without capitalism, we wouldn't kind of have the productive forces available today to even allow everybody to be housed, for instance. And I think that is something, that is why we have crises of overabundance within capitalism, as opposed to pre-capitalist crises, which is famine and things like that, which obviously we do experience in capitalism, but not because we're not producing enough, because we are producing enough. So I suppose for me, yeah, capitalism maybe a specific moment in history that was almost necessary to develop the means of production, but it creates a level of exploitation due to the exploitation of surplus labour by the capitalists towards the workers. But I think housing struggles are immensely important today, and I think they're mainly kind of a pressure point to reveal and highlight wider contradictions. I mean, we look at the 2008 crisis, the mortgage crisis, we're still feeling kind of repercussions from that. And we look at the next, I mean, Harvey talks about how the next crisis will be focused around the precariat, insecure workers, and renting. So I think housing is kind of at the forefront of understanding and highlighting the contradictions of capitalism at the moment.
Stuart, do you want to answer?
I don't know if we've got enough time to talk about what capitalism is. My God. Well, let me just add to what's been said on that. I think for me, capitalism is something that dates back centuries. It's been with us quite a long time now. It's a highly conflictual system, economic system, social system that is a totalizing system, or a system that seeks to totalize, to bring all spaces and people under its logic because of its own contradictions. Whether or not, or how we understand those contradictions in terms of the falling rate of profit, over-accumulation, under-consumption crises, to be honest with you, I don't like to go down those roads. For me, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that capitalism is a system that seeks to generate profit, and it needs to generate profit. Capitalists must profit. They must profit in order to expand, to compete, to reinvest, to get more profit. And this kind of endless need to accumulate, to grow, to expand is a political and social, also geographical phenomenon that you know, and therefore it's a system that is constantly asking questions of all of us. So every time that we struggle and fight because things that we thought were protected, things that thought they were ours, things that thought we had won, they're back up for being grabbed, for being put back into circulation, being put back into the circulation of capital to make profit. And when there are crises in one circuit of accumulation, whether the primary circuit of accumulation in the kind of sphere of production, then capital is able to displace those crises into other circuits of accumulation, which is why we see this kind of movement of capital into the built environment, into also education, into public services. And we see the role of the state being so important in facilitating that, because the state ultimately is, I don't like to say it as the capitalist state, but I think that the state in our present economic and social system acts towards the long-term interests of the system, because that is the dominant mode of production. So for me, capitalism is something that we have to confront in our daily lives. We have to organize against its logics and its injustices. And for me, I want to return to the point that David asked, and I suppose to answer you, Rebecca, as well. I don't make a distinction between the productive sphere and the reproductive sphere of capitalism. Now, Engels, I think, did, but I don't, because for me, and I don't see landlords as not capitalists. I know we can get into kind of theoretical debates whether landlords are capitalists or not, whether they're just, living off a system that capitalists and workers have produced value, and the landlord is just extracting value from the worker in some kind of commodity relationship. But I don't see it like that. For me, I see that capitalism organizes systems of profit making to produce things and for people to consume things. So for me, consumption and production have to be brought into an analysis, and we have to understand that capital moves from between those spheres all the time. and that consumption struggles are just as important as production struggles, but they're not more important, they're not less important. So just as we should be organising for better work wages and better conditions, and maybe to eventually become our own bosses, we should also be struggling for better housing, to push back landlordism, to push back the corporate takeover of housing as well. Because for me, they're all interconnected. Today's big capitalist enterprises are largely increasingly financial enterprises. They're interested in making money from everything, and they seek monopoly control of both production and consumption. But increasingly, they're interested in land and housing and other all the spaces of consumption, because the state is there to enable the transfer of not just our wages and our future wages, but also the state is there to hoover up resources, take resources from other parts of the world to again guarantee that as a profitable sphere for accumulation. So I don't make the distinction, and that's why for me housing is so important politically, that we see that housing is not just something that we just do because we just want better housing conditions. For me, housing politics can be very productive politically for taking on capitalism more broadly. So, you know, if there is you look at the power in society where it lies, the power lies at the moment increasingly finance, and finance is looking for to accumulate in the built environment. So if we want to take on powerful interests, then we have to organize, and ultimately when we reach a kind of post-capitalist moment, then that post-capitalist moment is going to require us to have also not just we don't leave things until after the revolution to sort out. We also want to be gradually taking control and understanding and learning how to do things for ourselves collectively in our own divisions of labor that are not directed through commodity production, but actually to meet human needs collectively. So we also need to collectively learn how to produce resources, make resources, maintain resources, and take collective ownership of them. Very long point, sorry.
Thanks. I'm going to read out a question from Anthony, which I think is good and isn't something that people have spoken about much yet. So this is from Anthony Melathopoulos. It seems like Sam and Lucy identify the housing problem as primarily one of profit. I would like to hear whether they think that the solution is state-owned housing. But also, I'd like to hear Stuart respond, because such arguments for more equal exchange tread close to Engels' critique of Proudhon, which Stuart was asking us to reconsider. Maybe Sam or Lucy, do you want to start? State-owned housing.
Do you want to start, Sam?
Yeah, I will do. I mean, I don't necessarily see state-owned housing as a solution. I think just as Stuart very clearly put right at the beginning, you know, Engels understood the housing problem as ultimately a problem of capitalism, and so ultimately, you know, if we make a load of state-owned housing, sorry, you're not going to resolve any issues, because that state is still driven, wound up in processes of profit production. Yeah, was there another point to it? Sorry, David.
That's right. No, just that.
Okay. I suppose that a solution. I think there's a importance in kind of questioning and attempting different solutions, and this is also touches on what Stuart was just saying, as a way of kind of guiding forward and showing potentially other ways of doing things. But I don't think that just creating solutions such as, let's say, a community land trust or state-owned housing is going to answer the question, because it still has to enter the commodity relationship in order to survive.
Stuart, do you agree with what Sam said? I'm curious about the community land trust point.
Yeah, I do agree, actually. Yeah, are you surprised by that, David? I don't know, but I agree that what I suppose we're getting at here is that whatever forms of housing we create, whatever forms of ownership structures, whatever social relations to housing we fight for and win, they're always precarious, they're always temporary. If elsewhere in the economic system, capitalism is still all dominant and all powerful, and in a way, it's impossible to create these nice spaces of housing production and consumption while leaving the rest of the system intact. So it's not going to happen. You know, you only have to look at how long it takes to set up community land trusts, co-ops. Any type of utopian community, any type of intentional housing community has to go through the existing planning system, has to raise capital, has to engage with the capitalist system and the legal system, and has to also win political favor. And so what you get in doing that, obviously, is that if you want your projects to flourish, you have to play the game. You can't just suddenly declare, you know, the People's Republic of Manchester on private land and expect to sort of like, oh, okay, well, that's fine. Yeah, you want a community land trust in Fallowfield? Yeah, no problem, just take it. They're going to come and say, get off our land. So what I'm saying is that we're always going to be in conflict with the structures of power and the norms and the laws of the system. We have to sort of push them back. We have to reshape and reframe them. We're doing it in relation to all other things at the same time. So I think Engels is saying you can't have a housing movement unless you also have all other kinds of movements, all fighting the wider mode of production. And I don't know whether he was faithfully reflecting on what anarchists were actually arguing at the time. I don't know whether I don't know whether it's whether their position was that simplistic. I haven't really myself studied it beyond engaging with Engels' his position and framing on it. I was more interested in that issue in terms of what it means today for the housing question, the politics of now, where you see all these different positions within the housing movement around whether or not we should engage with the state, whether or not we should kind of set up co-ops and squat, or whether we should like defend state housing, whether we should resist gentrification, or whether we should sort of maybe accept it and try to reform it and mitigate its kind of worst outcomes. And for me, it was interesting to think about what was that debate in the 1870s about, and what could it mean today? And I'm quite clear that now, given how capitalism itself has changed, and that doesn't mean that the very basic engines or logics of capitalism has changed, but capitalism as a system has clearly moved on since then. It has become more globalized. It's become more also more in crisis, because obviously its contradictions grow and grow all the time. So therefore, housing, land politics, the politics of health. Also, don't forget that the state has been forced to intervene at some point in history to try to resolve some of those contradictions, to enable the system to kind of be maintained in the long term. And those were, you can understand those as gains, as collective gains for the working class, but they also become new spaces for accumulation. And so we're always going to be in this struggle. We're always going to be in this struggle. And therefore, we shouldn't separate housing politics from other issues and things. And to answer the question about state housing, no, we shouldn't want state-owned housing as an ideal, but we may need state-owned housing as a temporary solution to a problem which private housing is creating. So we may need the state to intervene. We may want to change the way the state intervenes in housing, and we may end up with more council housing, public housing again. But we also need to therefore be mindful that just because the state temporarily intervenes to own housing again, it has no intention of doing it in the long term. It just wants to solve a problem in the short term, give in to a political demand, hope that movement goes away, and then at some point in the future, we'll seek to sell it all off again. So again, we just need to be mindful that there's no end point, there's no rest point here until that underpinning process of capitalism does come to an end somehow. And I feel like this debate needs to just recognize that we need to plug housing into all other struggles, but see them how they're connected to each other, not as separate single issue campaigns.
Thanks, Stuart. I don't know, Lucy, did you also want to reply to the question about state-owned housing, council housing?
Yeah, I broadly agree with Sam and Stuart. I don't know if I have much else to add other than that maybe perhaps
Can I just, maybe if I could add, can I just like elaborate on Anthony's question a tiny bit? Just, I mean,
Yeah.
often we hear like, I was at a meeting the other day where it was said that Thatcher's right to buy that was mentioned earlier was like an affront to working class power. And so you often do kind of hear this kind of anti-Thatcherist, anti-Thatcherite, anti-neoliberal rhetoric that kind of has social housing as its horizon of possibility, which I would say, I mean, I don't want to answer the question myself. So like, what do you think?
Yeah, I suppose the right to buy was a bit of an affront, and I think it set us back. Well, I wasn't around then, and I wouldn't be around for a good few years after right to buy started, but I think it did set us back. I suppose what Stuart was saying earlier about private property sort of subduing the revolutionary masses, because if you own a house and you have a stake in the society, you're less likely to do something stupid like start a revolution, something like that. So I do, yeah, broadly agree that right to buy didn't help for a variety of reasons. And this idea that working people need a house, need to own home, need to own a property is just, I think it's silly, and it's a conservative ideology thingy that's just dumb. Yeah, that's my that's my take. It's just dumb. No, and I think nationalising, or not even nationalising, more state-owned homes would almost work in the same way. It would almost push us back in that we'd probably become more subdued because we've got this nice house, and maybe there's less of a obvious struggle if we've all got homes. But I suppose it's a complicated question, and I don't have much else to elaborate on that, I don't think.
No, that's interesting. Thanks.
I just wanted to just chip in a bit more on the right to buy. So I think the right to buy. Can you hear me still? Yeah. Yeah. The right to buy was not just a political strategy, I think, which was clearly designed to undermine the Labour Party at the time, as well as Labour local authorities, to create to try to win the working class voters towards Thatcher. Right, and that's clearly was what one of the things that Thatcher had worked on. But it was also about opening up public housing stocks to finance capital. The state had borrowed and built this housing, and that was in one area of finance that was invested in the bond markets. But then you've got clamour for more opportunities for finance to accumulate. So let's put it out to sale. Tenants will need mortgages, so that then also makes them get them into debt, and that also is a subduing. Of course, it's a subduing strategy to say you're now indebted. You also own your own home. You've now got to sort of keep your house, and you need to behave. You also need to take out the mortgage, which is putting some of your wages to the banks and the mortgage providers and so on, which accompanied the whole mortgage liberalisation, and the whole financialisation of mortgages was all kind of built, or partly built upon that. But it was also a way of hiding the fact that the state was not going to build any housing, or was not going to ensure that housing got built, which would build up long-term shortages of housing, which would then get us in the situation we're in today. But that's all part of the strategy to make housing scarce, and scarce housing makes housing expensive, and it also underpins gentrification processes, and it pushes people in and pushes people out. So these, and I don't see these things as accidental. These things are actually part of a strategy of accumulation, how the state has worked on behalf of the people that it has been representing. But in terms of how do we then view the right to buy and the politics of it, to oppose the right to buy then was seen as very, very dangerous for the left, because people were getting their home and they were getting it very cheap, and they were able to say, this is my house, I own a property. And that's also very, very important. So I think the left has really struggled on the issue of property ownership and how people maybe aspire to it, not necessarily because it's a financial asset, but because actually people want to be able to have something that's theirs. So the left has always struggled on this issue, and I think continues to struggle because people don't want to rent, people want to buy. And the ideology of home ownership is incredibly powerful. And so if we're going to intervene in capitalist politics, then we have to think a lot about how do we go after something that's actually quite popular and still resonates with a lot of people and say, no, you're wrong. You really don't want to own, because owning will make you more conservative. That's fine. I don't mind. I want to own my own home. I don't want to be giving money to the landlord. So public housing becomes for me, a great solution to the idea that you're renting, but you're putting back into the common pot. So I'm in favour of a common form of ownership. Absolutely. I don't want to be a homeowner myself. I want to be someone whose wages can be recycled into improving other people's homes. But that is such a huge ideological battle to wage. And just finally, I think it's a really important point to make that the right to buy didn't give working class people this property that then became theirs for life. I mean, so many people have had their homes repossessed. So many people ended up buying a really, really poor house, and and the quality of it was very, very bad, and it's cost them a lot of money. They've had to sell up and move on. They've also sold out to private landlords. I mean, 40 to 50% of all right to buy sales are now owned by private landlords, because the problems in the other parts of capitalism weren't addressed. So people had a property, but they still didn't have enough money necessarily to service the mortgage debt and so on. These are all very live issues. They haven't gone away. And in a way that the line from Engels to the present day continues around this issue of property ownership, home ownership, and it's a very difficult one politically.
Thanks. Got a question from Danny Jacobs. Slightly different topic on education. I don't know if Danny wants to read it out.
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, and I think I'm reading the second one. Yeah, let's say that. Okay. And I'll clarify anything if it's confusing, so I can stay on as well. The modern growth in rents is partially related to the explosion in higher education. Education, historically in capitalism, has served as a way of organizing the industrial reserve. It's better to go to school and stay in school. Otherwise, you have to compete with someone who has plus 5 years on their CV, right, if you've graduated recently from undergrad. But this means that the demands of many leftists, the demand for universal education, naturalize this need and can often serve a role in driving rents, not just in housing, but also education, so student loans. What looks quote unquote progressive can at times serve to intensify the problems of capitalism. How does one use this as an opportunity to promote an independent organizing? And I think this goes back to what was just being discussed. So independent from the state, and not rely on the state to intensify the issue through reforms, right? So, subsidies for higher education or student housing in that case, which can intensify this problem. And if any clarification, I can also point things out. Thank you. Thank you for the panel as well.
Thanks very much, Danny.
Do you mind if I just? I think what you touched on there, Danny, was really interesting. I think what it really reveals is kind of this the contradictions that we face, particularly today within the modern left, as well. This notion that somebody pushing for a progressive practice without necessarily questioning the bourgeois mode of production kind of it doesn't really solve anything. it just kind of shifts the problem elsewhere. So I think that these issues that we have, they can be great starting points for kind of raising awareness and things, but it really needs to be pushed beyond that. So I don't necessarily have anything to say specifically about the question, but it was kind of a more overall comment about it.
Thanks, Sam. Stuart or Lucy, do you want to talk about Danny's question?
Danny, I didn't understand the question, mate. I'm so sorry. And I started writing it down, and then I got lost as I was trying to write the words down fast enough to then start making my notes. Could you ask it again? Just
Yes, is there a way that I had sent it in the chat, so I don't know if there's a way
oh,
that,
sorry. Okay.
yeah. I don't know if there's a way that it can be.
Don't think I can see it.
I can send it to Stuart, but maybe if I could just summarize what I understood by the question, which was that I think the crux of Danny's question was about what independent working class organizing on anything, including housing, might look like, which would be, I think he's saying, would be necessary for the left if it was to try to avoid its kind of oscillating relationship with the state and with reformism and with social democracy. And I don't know if, Danny, that's kind of like a fair, was that a fair summary?
I'm trying to say that also the demands end up intensifying, you know, exactly what people are responding to. In other words, high rents, high student loans, and then those demands can actually play a part in indirectly pushing for higher rents and higher loans. And also that education and housing in a lot of ways are ways of organizing the industrial reserve, right? And so I think this is something Sam brought up in his introduction. And so I was asking, like, well, how do we actually independently organize and not just play in this kind of vicious cycle, as I think David was just saying?
Just another massive question for a Saturday afternoon. I mean, in terms of, I'll just focus a little bit on housing, if you don't mind, because that's how my brain works. How do we create an independent working class organization around housing? Well, first thing is we need to, I think, maybe widen our understanding of what a working class is in relation to housing first. For me, some of the housing movement politics tends to fetishize or elevate particular struggles and people, whether it be maybe private renters or social housing tenants. I think that we have to think of all people in the housing, who experience a housing crisis as part of the housing movement. And yeah, they might not be kind of like officially or like traditionally seen as working class, but they have they're in a power relationship with global corporate landlords. They're in terrible housing conditions and unsafe conditions, and I think that they are also the basis for an independent housing movement. So whether or not we need to think of it as being an independent working class movement, or whether we think that it'd be productive to bring those different people and their struggles together to have more of a just and safer and secure housing system, I find that more productive politically. But in terms of independent organising, I think it's essential that we absolutely build independent housing organisations, but not just about housing. They're more like community-based struggles that are interested in all aspects of how people experience exploitation, injustice, and so on. So often housing is a great anchor for those struggles because of the importance of home, of shelter, for individual and family life, for having an anchoring community, for also having a place to socially reproduce and go back to work. So housing seems to me always have this kind of slightly special importance in community struggles and community organising, and you can actually build around that. So, but yeah, I suppose we need more community level independent working class organisations that are defending people's interests, on which we can build something more powerful. I'm not particularly a fan of thinking that we can just sort all these things out by joining a party and organising in that way. I think we also have to organise our own community-based vehicles politically and join them up.
Thanks, Stuart. Lucy, if you don't mind, can I bring in another question?
That's fine with me.
Unless you really wanted to reply to this.
No, I was a bit confused by it, and I think
Okay.
Stuart and
Okay,
Sam
let's
answered
go
it really
with
well. So,
Ephraim, can you ask your question? Ephraim from London.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Thanks, everyone. I've got two parts, two different questions. One's more directed at Stuart and Sam, and the other's specifically to Lucy. I think I'm maybe would push back on something Stuart said, which is that Engels would have been horrified by regeneration schemes. I know they're packaged in a certain way, but one of the most important things Engels wrote with Marx was the Communist Manifesto, which describes how revolutionary capitalism is, how it sweeps away, the train of feudal rights and all this solid melts to air. And Engels would have been very opposed to what he would have seen as kind of petty bourgeois or reactionary forms of anti-commodification or anti-capitalism, which would seek to kind of reinstate some kind of organic unity, small is beautiful. And it sounds like that's what you're advocating, Sam. And Stuart, I just wonder there as well, like, what does Engels kind of see is revolutionary about capitalism, and how does that relate to this housing question in terms of, obviously there are people who oppose the redevelopment of land in capitalism on the basis of preserving traditional communities in a way that actually isn't related to socialist politics at all. And for Lucy, then, I'd like to, seeing as you're kind of currently involved in some kind of housing activism, but you do also, I'm not sure about Sam and Stuart, what their politics are, but you identify as a socialist, I would guess, being, you described earlier being a revolutionary socialist. And so I'm wondering why you joined Counterfire, and how what is it about Counterfire's politics that relates for you? Like, how do you relate your housing activism to that? And what kind of political organization do you think is necessary, therefore, or is implicit in your kind of working with Counterfire in order to overcome capitalism?
Thanks, Ephraim. Which of you'd like to go first? Come on, Sam.
Yeah, I think maybe I didn't explain myself properly, but I think maybe you. It's not what I'm advocating for at all. I can promise you that. This notion of this idea of small scale community land trusts, or the practices that Reach are performing, such as building small scale housing projects. That's not the point of my politics at all. It's kind of more of a point of analysing these movements, and through that revealing and understanding more about our present and wider political economy. So how through those we can reflect back on capitalism, which is kind of through understanding the minutiae of capitalism, how we can reflect back on it as a whole, which is kind of what Adorno talks about when talking about it's a Saturday evening, I've forgotten the theory off the top of my head, the dialectic. And I hope that answers your question. So I guess I'm not necessarily sure what I would term myself as at the moment, and I think that kind of perhaps fits a little bit into Platypus and the definition of Platypus as well.
Yeah. Stuart or Lucy? Stuart, maybe? I think we're going to take one more question after this, by the way, and maybe ask you to kind of wrap up any concluding remarks with that one. But
maybe we can hear from Lucy then, because I had a direct question for her.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for that question. I do consider myself a revolutionary socialist, and Counterfire is a revolutionary socialist group organisation. I suppose I'm relatively new to sort of housing activism. I wouldn't consider myself necessarily an activist that focuses on housing, even though I'm obviously at a panel on housing. I think it's through the student activism that I've come to get involved in this idea of housing. Obviously, I'm greatly passionate around things like Grenfell and homelessness and that kind of stuff, but I've never looked this deeply into it before. So I am relatively new to it. I suppose, how do I relate this activism surrounding housing to Counterfire, and why I'm involved in Counterfire as well? I would say that Counterfire is aligns with my views and the views of Marx and Engels, and that housing is a problem, a byproduct of capitalism and that kind of stuff. I think I can relate all my activism, I suppose, to Counterfire, because I suppose it's where I get my political philosophy from anyway. It sort of educated me in that way, and through reading groups and theory and writing for them, and act like it's not just writing that we do. We also go out and build united front work, which we see is greatly important. So we work with things like Stop the War and the People's Assembly, and it's just, I suppose, through that my activism and theory, I suppose, have sort of collided, and I've come to get involved in student politics, and through that, I suppose, housing, which I'm very new to, I've not really looked at before. I think you also asked how Counterfire's sort of fights capitalism, or fights against inequality and injustice in this way. I think that's what you said, or how their views line up with what we're here today to talk about, and the evils of capitalism. I simply say that Counterfire is also a revolutionary socialist organisation, and Counterfire's views are very much the views that have been expressed today. We base a lot of us, philosophy on Engels and Marx, and I suppose Trotsky as well. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Thank you for asking about Counterfire and my own activism. I hope I answered your questions, but I suppose if you want to learn more about Counterfire that maybe isn't in this, or me, or my activism isn't in this panel, just shoot me a message or find me on Facebook or something, and I'll be happy to talk to you in a more detail if you require it. If you don't, obviously don't worry.
Thanks for that, Lucy. So maybe let's take one last question and ask you to kind of sum up any sort of concluding thoughts and reflections, etc. And so this is a question from Mike Atkinson, who's going to moderate the next panel, which maybe I should just quickly plug now before we finish, which obviously is starting in 1 hour and 5 minutes. So I hope that everyone can come back and join after maybe like a quick dinner break. I'm really excited. We've got 3 different panelists there. We're going to focus more on the question of tenants organizing, and on organizing work, like obviously different kinds of organizing, workers organizing, community organizing, and their relationship to the present situation of the left in Britain. But I'm going to bring in Mike to ask this kind of like question that, yeah, Mike, if you could ask your question.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you who participated for everything you said. So I've got a couple of questions that I've designed to be these sort of concluding questions. So while I'm going to mention specific people at certain points, the questions are for all of you. Dr. Hodkinson said that Right to Buy was an attempt by the Thatcher government to undermine the Labour Party and to win the hearts of the working class. But I want to ask you all, and I think this question relates to Danny's, to what extent was and is the Labour Party doing the same thing? That is, undermining the idea of socialism by directing strategies ultimately towards capitalistic state solutions and the preservation of these social relations that they then describe as socialism. So is public housing the same thing as being free of landlords, as freedom from private ownership? Because it seems to me that the working class thinks otherwise. And I wonder if it would be wise for the left to try to understand why that is. More generally, what then is the relation of fighting injustices and crises like these to overcoming capitalism? We describe the former immediate battles with injustice as stepping stones or ways and means, or as Sam did, starting points. But how? When? What are they? What have they started? Are we actually any closer to abolishing capitalism? Lucy said that every little helps, but I'm asking, does it? The abolition of capitalism must be practical, of course, but does that mean that all forms of practice are valid, or may they, in the last analysis, actually contribute to the conservation of capitalism? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Maybe if you could speak in the order that we started in, and respond to Mike's question and any kind of concluding remarks from the panel, that'd be really great. Or we can go in a different order if you prefer.
I don't mind kicking off.
Great.
There's a lot in that question, so I suppose to answer it in one sort of overarching way. For me, I think when we talk about housing politics, I think that we should be focusing in on the politics of decommodification and the politics of commoning. For me, it's about creating commons, pushing back finance, pushing back capital, pushing back the logic of accumulation, and trying to create our own, collectively, our own resources, our own collectively owned and collectively managed housing, health, education, and so on. Now, I don't regard that as something that just happens overnight. I don't regard it as something that you just do it and it all comes good. I think it's a long-term struggle. So I don't buy the Engels line that we must get out of the way of capitalism and let it do its worst, so that it will all be kind of revolutionized by the end of it and it will all just be overthrown. And that's a very crude, obviously, a way of characterizing what he said. But I don't believe that you get out of the way of the forces of modernization. I don't believe that you allow commodification to sort of take its full to its fullest extent, which then produces revolutionary consciousness. I think on the opposite, I think you resist commodification and you fight back against capitalist enclosure wherever you can, because for me that's how you A, educate people about what it is. It's B, how you join together and collectivize, and C, it's how you actually begin to collectively take back things that are ours. I don't want to wait, but also I don't want to engage in kind of reformist politics that ultimately like rearranges the deck chairs on the Titanic, or gives us a few crumbs from the top table, as maybe many of the Labour Party's policies currently are. I think that ultimately we have to organise at every scale. I don't like this idea that you kind of create a binary between big and small, or micro versus macro. I think you have to organise at different scales and connect those scales up politically. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I next? I think I am. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the question. I would agree, I suppose, that the Labour Party does undermine socialism through its reformist policies, but that's because I'm a revolutionary, I suppose, in that reform I don't see as particularly useful to the end goal of what is getting capitalism. You can't reform capitalism, you have to smash it, get rid of it. And I think the Labour Party is largely in place to make things a little bit easier for working people rather than to make things really, really hard for the elites. And I think, does every little help? It's a good question. Are all forms of activism valid, or do they undermine socialism in the same way that perhaps the Labour Party does? And I would say, yeah, all forms of activism are crucial. Grassroots activism, that is, or not even grassroots, or just working people standing up and fighting. I mean, I suppose people have asked a couple of times, it's like, how do we get rid of capitalism if we're focusing on little battles? How do we in one single battle just destroy capitalism? How is that possible? I think every revolution ever has started with something. There has to be a catalyst to push this. A recent example, so the Black Lives Matter stuff in the US, I would argue that was almost revolutionary, those protests that were happening day after day after day, and sadly they seem to be not really revolutionary now, but I think we did get pretty close, maybe not pretty close, but it was a revolutionary sort of scene. But then you could argue that how are we going to destroy capitalism if we're focusing on Black Lives Matter? I think you have to fight these little battles because maybe one day eventually they'll become a really big battle. And I think, for example, the student stuff right now, if we hadn't necessarily fought that small battle with Nancy Rothwell and the University of Manchester, then this rent strike across the country that's happening and these occupations that are being planned wouldn't ever have happened. You need something to start it off. maybe you need a vanguard or something like that. I think every little does help. Activism is valid. I think if we sort of sat down and said, oh, I'm not going to go to that protest because it's actually not just going to, it's just not going to end capitalism, we wouldn't get very far at all. I think I'm a firm believer that you have to just keep fighting and eventually maybe you'll win. You know, so yeah, I hope that's answered your question. I suppose I don't really have any other remarks to make other than this has been a fantastic meeting. It's been very, very interesting. And I think it's always important that you try and speak on the same panels as people who are a lot cleverer than you, and that's how you get cleverer. So that's well, no, we're not. You know, I'm not imposter syndroming, but I just think, you know, it's interesting to speak on panels with people who know a lot, where I don't necessarily know the same amount. But yeah, it's been really helpful, and thank you to everyone for having me.
I'm glad. Well, we do try and organise panels with Platypus that include different types of people from different backgrounds, different tendencies on the left, academics and activists. I didn't say that before, but I'm glad that you could join us, Lucy. So yeah, Sam.
Yeah. So I think perhaps just as well, for the start, trust it to be Mike that leaves us on a blinder of a question like that. I think as so kind of just as Engels kind of went around understanding the conditions of the working class and kind of allowing that to understand the different situations. Kind of it's very different to how we view the Labour Party today, where people are being told on high, this is socialism, and every MP seems to be a socialist nowadays somehow. Whilst calling themselves socialists, I should say, whilst somehow maintaining class interests. I can't necessarily speak any more on that, other than to say that myself am no longer a member of the Labour Party, as I'm sure many other people have come to realise. And I think that's been quite an interesting awakening for me. As for the activism and everything, I think, first of all, Lucy, I don't think you should do yourself down, particularly about being on this panel. I think the things that you've been getting up to with the strike and stuff have been quite commendable. But I think that there is a limitation to and we shouldn't say that all forms of organisation are valid. Personally, I think that that activism should be a tool to reveal these contradictions of capitalism, and we shouldn't be focusing on the end point of the activism, a reform in housing or whatever it is, to be the end point of it itself. It should be a tool to reveal and highlight these further contradictions so we can undermine them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks very much, everyone. It's been really good to have you all. Just a very quick plug again, so with Platypus Manchester, we run reading groups and coffee breaks every week, which happen on Tuesday for the reading group at 6 p.m. and Friday for the coffee break at 5 p.m. and they happen on Zoom, and everyone's welcome to join. It'd be really good to see you there, and on Friday we're going to sort of reflect on this panel discussion and the one that's happening in an hour. So thanks again. Hopefully you can join us in just under an hour and ask questions and try and sort of bring the two panel discussions into dialogue with each other. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. I'm going to end the meeting, and so you have the Zoom link for the next panel, which is the same one as this one. Thanks very much.